And I have heard that that Minnesota is like 5th on the list of states for the existence of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. So
this is Democratic Visions.
Hi, I'm Mike McIntee. I am joined here today by Laurie Pryor, Representative Laurie Pryor, who represents the Eden Prairie and Minnetonka area here in the Twin Cities. It is her first term in the legislature. We want to talk about the issues that you've been running into there, as well as the experiences you've had. I know you just came from a town hall meeting this morning. You and Steve Swazinski, the senator who represents the same area. What do constituents want to talk about these days?
Well, first of all, we had a great turnout. I think that's part of the answer is the fact that people do want to talk. This is not a time of apathy, which I find to be very encouraging and, gives us hope.
Does the gun bills that you're talking about, do any of those require court decisions first, or is that something that legislation?
We began with talking about gun violence and how to prevent it, and also related to that, how to keep kids safe at school. And what we can do as a legislature, what we can do as a community, what we can do as a state to accomplish those things. And that was the number one topic this morning. And this was, even though there was a march going on in a different location where that was the focus, it took up most of our session this morning because that was something that people wanted to talk about.
Now, guns seems to be one of those issues that shouldn't be partisan, but has kind of turned partisan. It's an issue driven by fear. When people talk to you about guns, tell me about what you've had, what your interaction has been like, what your conversation has been like with them and others.
So there's two groups right now, and the one group is talking about the absolute unequivocal need to have some gun safety legislation, and that we need to have it now. And then there's another group that just as strongly insists that there should be zero legislation relating to gun safety and to firearms. The way it's being discussed is polarized right now, and that polarization, I think, is showing up in terms of a partisan divide in the legislature. So even though there are bipartisan bills out there relating to regulating firearms, because there's one party that controls the majority in the legislature in both the House and the Senate, the Republican Party, those bills are not advancing through the legislative process. It doesn't look like we will be able to get them onto the actual floor into a public debate where everybody's representative can choose to vote yes or no to it, and then the public would know where we stand. It looks like they're going to stay tabled in the House.
Now, Governor Dayton, I think when he was talking about this issue, addressed that and said, well, we know those aren't going to go anywhere, so let's just set those aside. Do you think that was the right thing for him to do, or do you think you should have pushed for, hey, we do really need to talk about this?
The governor has to take his position because he's the governor of all of the issues that we have to address in the Senate and the House. If he doesn't think he can move it forward, then I can understand where he would say, let's move on and deal with the other issues. But I don't think that, as another representative, I don't feel that way. I feel like I need to keep talking to my colleagues. I need to keep talking to my constituents and encouraging them to keep bringing this issue forward, because I think that we should talk about it in this session and this year.
Talk about it. Do you have a position on some of the bills that are out there?
I do have two bills right now that have been introduced that I'm a co-author of. And they're the two bills that Representative Dave Pinto is the author on. And one of them is the gun violence protection orders. And this is kind of a process that's already in place for other kinds of situations. But this is one saying very specifically that if somebody in a household recognizes there's another person in the household, or if there's somebody in a family that recognizes another family member is an imminent threat to either that themselves or to somebody else or other people, then they can go to the authorities. There's a judicial process for taking the firearms away from that person. So this is recognizing that there's a danger for people involved, using due process and removing those firearms, which will keep people safer. And we know we can think of all those occasions where we've seen in the news where firearms were part of a crime and that they were deadly and that they could even be mass shootings. And they could have been prevented if this order had been in place and it was an option that people could have used. And other states have done this and have found it to be, it is constitutional. It doesn't threaten somebody's Second Amendment rights because it's stepping in only when there's a clear and present danger.
Now, there was both these bills got one hearing, and,
right.
they got tabled. And during that hearing, the gun lobby showed up, and they testified that they represented all gun owners across the state of Minnesota. And there was pushback on that, saying that not all gun owners are on the same page, saying that there shouldn't be regulations. Have you talked to gun owners? Do you finding that?
Gun owners do contact me, and I mean, I think that your summary is correct. You know, there's some gun owners where they say, yes, we do. I very much respect these kinds of regulations being put in place. And then there's other gun owners. I get a series of emails, and the subject line is saying, no gun regulation.
Now, let's back up here just a little bit, because when we talk about guns and we talk about a lot of issues, what we're really trying to talk about is of having a feeling of safety, no matter where we are, whether we are at a school, whether we are at a shopping mall, whether we're in our neighborhood, whether we're in our home. And it has to do with a lot of different things, and I know you are trying to address that on many different fronts. Talk to me about that.
But we know that we have other challenges other than gun violence. We know right now that there is an opiate epidemic, and opiates, that epidemic, that addiction to opiates, we see it threatening our safety and the health in different ways. First of all, we see people dying of overdoses. 400 in 2016 from overdose deaths. When people are not being able to get the prescription opiates, they're turning to heroin. There's just more crime surrounded from heroin addiction too, and also leading to deaths. One thing about this opiate challenge is that we are seeing bipartisan support for addressing it. We are working on together to try to come up with probably the most effective ways of dealing with it. So you begin with prevention, and that's to understand the prescribing of opiates and to make sure that they're not prescribed in areas for things that they should not be prescribed for, which would lead to addiction. So prevention, then also treatment of the addictions, because it's an addiction, and it needs effective treatment. And there's a lot of people that are not getting into those effective treatments right now. And then the third thing is education. And so it's understanding, at an early age, what an opiate is and how it can affect you and how you can become addicted to it. And also understanding, if there's someone that what they're going through, if they seem to have an opiate, if they may be addicted to opiates. So there's a lot of education around this too. Now,
The other day, I was watching our president, Donald Trump, talk about opioids, and his approach to this was, well, we're going to put some rules and regulations out there. I want to deal with the drug companies, but he didn't really put a lot of money at that. What he really wanted to do was say, what we need to do is build a wall to stop all those drugs coming in from Mexico and the immigrants who are doing this. And that struck me as really not the problem you just talked about. Can you talk about the difference between those two and how you think what really needs to happen here?
At the state level, we understand that it's this system that we have to deal with, and that we have to deal with it in all these fronts, and that you just can't find that that one magic solution like building a wall and we can stop all of it, because the heroin and opiates can come from so many different sources that we can't shut down. But what we can shut down is the addiction to them.
Oh, we kind of got into this talking about making people feel safe, safety. Are there other issues kind of under that banner that you look at that you think the legislature should be tackling?
We've been talking about sexual exploitation. What we've come to understand is that the young people that are being coerced, forced, seduced, whatever it is, into a life of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, it's happening at an early age. And it can be in that age range of 12 or 9 to 14 that young people are being recruited into this and forced into this. And it starts with the vulnerabilities. And it can be a sexual abuse that they've been suffering, makes them vulnerable to be caught up in this life. It can be just from poverty. The perpetrators are able to recognize those vulnerabilities and pull these young people into these lives that once they're in, once they're trapped in, is almost impossible to escape from. This is an issue that we talked about in this last legislature, and we had one way of addressing it to prevent it was to start teaching about what sexual exploitation is, to start teaching it in schools. And first of all, we talked about just giving schools permission to teach about it, because now some schools say, well, that's off. We can't talk about that. That's too serious. That's too grim. Parents won't be happy with this. But we're actually moving towards even mandating that schools teach this, saying that schools must teach it. Of course, if we mandate it, we have to put some funding and resources behind it so it will be done in a way that's most effective and doesn't take away from other parts of education. So it's raising the awareness to say this is something that's going on in Minnesota, all over Minnesota, and we have to start addressing it. And I have heard that that Minnesota is like 5th on the list of states for the existence of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation.
When you talk about having to bring this into the schools, do you have the support of teachers and the parents when you bring this up? How does that interaction happen?
The exciting part of this story is that it came forward to us from a group of girls, high school juniors, and they're in a group called Girls United Minnesota. And they bring in speakers, and one of their speakers talked about sex trafficking, and they realized that it was going on in their school, that a couple years before that there had been a girl that trafficked another girl in their high school. So they said, we're not going to let this stand, we're going to do something. And they were the ones that came to me and came to other legislators to say, we want to learn about this at an early age so that we can prevent this from happening again. And if we see it happening, we would know how to help somebody that's being exploited this way. Teachers and administrators at their high school said, we support you in this, but we would like to see the legislative backing for it too. Girls United Minnesota were the driving force to get this piece of legislation heard. And so where we stand right now, it was heard both in the House and the Senate and our education committees. Right now it's part of the omnibus education bill, and it was also passed as a standalone bill that is sitting on the House floor right now and on the Senate floor and could be called up before the end of the session to be passed into law. And I can add, talking with the Girls United, they are inspiring. They are committed, and they are articulate and clear about what the issue is, and also about what their goal is to accomplish. And what's very motivating is that there's a sense that they're not going to take no for an answer.
Let's talk about a close cousin to this. We've heard a lot about the Me Too movement, the sexual harassment.
Right.
I've watched Representative Erin Murphy stand on the floor and talk about how she grew up and working as a waitress and was sexually harassed. We've heard stories of many women coming forward at the legislature talking about how this is a problem. I mean, it permeates society, but the legislature is trying to police itself on this. How are we doing on that this time around?
We did do a training in the first week of session. There was probably mixed evaluations of how effective that training was, but I think that it was better that there was a training than that there wasn't a training, and that I think that there is a different awareness of this issue than there has been in previous years. And we know even now, everybody understands there's consequences for sexually harassing. Tony Cornish is no longer a state representative. And that's, I think, a positive development. So I think that we've changed in a way that we can't go back. Or we can't go back quickly.
Right.
I should reframe that. We might go back, but it won't be quick. And what we need to do, though, is to keep moving forward on this issue. And we do need to have processes in place that will be so that we're able to deal with the issue more quickly and more effectively than we are right now. We in the House DFL, we're talking about having an independent group be able to investigate harassment claims. Because right now the problem is there's this overlap between partisan politics and power politics between individuals. And that's a bad dynamic. So we're thinking that having an independent investigation of things and an independent look at things is going to be more effective than to keep it within the party structure.
Because right now, if there is, you have to make an ethics complaint, and it goes to a committee that is split between the Republicans and the Democrats. And too often, it seems like ethics things boil down to partisan issues. And I think that may be one of the reasons that people are hesitant to come forward, because the current system really doesn't work very well.
I think that's true. There just always needs to be a process in place that fits the environment that you're working in.
Let's talk about being new to the legislature, because this is your first term. I mean, this is the second year of the first term, but you've had a chance here to kind of see how things work. Some people always say, if you like sausages, don't go to a sausage factory. You like politics. What's it been like now being in the legislature?
It's very stimulating, I guess, is part of it. And so I think I was close enough to the process before that I didn't have large illusions about what the process was like. So I had some idea about how things work. When I was in high school, that's when Richard Nixon resigned after, I'm not afraid to date myself, when he resigned because of Watergate. So it's hard to go down from there in terms of what you think about politics, because that certainly was a low point in our country when the President of the United States had to resign because of what he had done as a politician. So I've been moving up since then. I think one thing that I found, though, as a new legislator, and that's probably the most challenging, is that you really have to know about everything, or you have to know something about everything and not ignore it, because there's issues all over the state, and you can't just say, well, the only thing that matters now is gun violence and sexual harassment, and just focus on those. You have to keep talking about mowing ditches. And you have to talk about muskie in northern lakes, and you have to talk about nutrition in schools. And there's just so many issues that you have to follow and be able to think about. That's what the learning curve is, and that's what the energy curve is too, is to feel like you can quickly get to speed and be able to engage in an intelligent way about a wide variety of issues.
Now, the DFL is in the minority this session. It is probably something that a lot of people feel frustrated with, because there are so many issues that get pushed to the side or don't get pushed through. Are you frustrated about that? Do you find that frustration? And B, how do you see that might change in the future?
Well, things swing away from whichever party has the presidency. And it can be 10 votes is not unusual to see a swing of that magnitude. So that would change the 11 seats would change the dynamics, change the majority in the House, and that would change the dynamics of the legislature. And then the agenda would change. We would be changing the conversation with a different party in control of the House. Instead of having gun violence prevention on the table, not talked about, not advancing, it's something that would advance. Even if the bills changed from where they are right now to be more of a compromise position, they would at least be advancing and being worked on to improve them. And now they're not. They're just sitting there.
As being part of the minority, working with the Republican majority, do you find that are Republicans listening on any points? Do you find that there is compromise? Is there bipartisan work going on? Because so much of us hear about, gridlock and nothing. It's one party or the other. What's your experience there?
Well, when we're talking about these issues, the sexual exploitation, that was a bipartisan issue, because it would not have been heard in the Education Committee if it didn't have bipartisan support. It would not have passed the Education Committee without bipartisan support. The chief author is a Republican. So it is an issue that everybody agrees we need to address. And when we're talking about making our schools more safe and secure, there are provisions that have bipartisan support. And it's being worked out what's the most effective way of doing this. But addressing that part of it as an issue does have bipartisan support.
Laurie, thank you so much for the interview, Representative Laurie Pryor. If you're interested in what's going on at the legislature, I suggest another resource, which is the uptake.org. We live stream all of the meetings that are happening at the legislature on television. You can watch them live, and of course, that's powered by your donations. Transparency in government is important, so help us out there. And if you'd just like to talk politics, join me over at AM 950 Radio. I'm on from 4 to 5 o'clock every day. So we'll talk to you on the radio.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers from Eden Prairie, Hopkins, Minnetonka, Edina, and Bloomington. Watch us on select cable systems and on our YouTube channel. This is Carol Sundstrom.